Pink Floyd are one of the most predominant and celebrated rock bands of all time. I'm Paul Anderson, and this is A Saucer Full of Secrets, a look at some of Pink Floyd's classic recordings from David Gilmour's perspective.
We sat down to work, and we worked very hard to make a record of music that we liked. We had a point to prove.
Roger loved being a frontman, leaping up and down, banging gongs and being dramatic.
Obviously, the flavour of the pop group changed fairly radically when Sid left. He was the writer, the guitar player and the singer. There are periods of time where it really doesn't turn me on to listen to it. It makes me cringe. It's like all the goals that you've been striving for since you're a teenager have suddenly been achieved, and you've got to say, well, now what's the goal?
The origins of Pink Floyd developed at Cambridge High School in the early 60s, when Syd Barrett, Dave Gilmour and Roger Waters were all students. Having left school, Dave Gilmour formed his own band, Jokers Wild, and went to live in France, while Syd formed Pink Floyd, with Waters, Nick Mason and Rick Wright in 1966. The band's reputation was fueled by their embryonic light show using liquid lights and slides. Pink Floyd reached the national spotlight after the launch party for the International Times magazine at the Roundhouse in 1966. When the UFO Club was opened in December, the Floyd were adopted as virtually a house band. In 1967, the band released their debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Shortly after the album's release, Syd Barrett started showing signs of emotional stress, and David Gilmour was drafted back in.
My previous band, where we'd done covers, had packed up. The other guys in it who were from Cambridge had all gone back to Cambridge, and I was sort of sulking in London saying, I'm not bloody going back to Cambridge. And I was working, I had a day job, as necessity dictates, you know. So I was spending my time going to gigs, seeing what people were doing, and trying to work out how the hell to get started into something again, when luckily they asked me and I didn't have to go through that.
The band continued gaining critical acclaim and a small but loyal following.
I wasn't there when it all started myself, personally speaking. I was living in France in my band, and I sort of got back to England in September or something of 1967, when UFO had, I think, already closed down by then. And the Middle Earth in Covent Garden was the one. They went to take part in a whole experience of lights and music and all the other things that go along with it.
The press was soon proclaiming the band as masters of psychedelia.
I don't think that we thought that what we were doing, although it was titled by some people psychedelia, maybe when Sid was there it was a more apt title, but we certainly didn't think that what we were doing was fueled by mind-altering substances, by LSD or anything like that. It all was perfectly logical, what we were doing, just on a normal human scale. We tried to create a mind-altering experience without any of the use of, I mean, drugs weren't necessarily a part of it. People did constantly get us wrong.
It soon became evident that Sid could no longer continue as a member of the band.
I don't know if Roger and the others have any guilt about the creation of his madness. I mean, it's just one of those things you can't foresee, fueled by so-called friends providing him with mind-altering substances, which he, unlike many other people, couldn't cope with.
Sid's continuing with the group didn't seem like it was a runner, really, and we sort of were very quickly back in the studio, and we were doing things, and it began to feel like that we could do things that would be different but good. The live shows were getting better and better, and frankly, we just didn't have time to think about it at that stage. thinking about it came a little bit later on. 1968, there were no days off. We were either in the studio or we were gigging in England, Europe or America. There wasn't time to think. Whether Sid's actual mental health could have been better helped at the time, I am unsure about. I suspect possibly yes. I mean, in this day and age, I think he would have been dragged off into something like the Priory and pumped with some sort of drug that would have given his brain the time to rest and perhaps repair itself. And in those days, the ethos in these matters tended to be rather along the lines that love and those sort of things, you know, a rather gentle approach might do it. I'm not sure that I still believe that that's the best way. There is evidence, you know, strong evidence to show that some of the drug regimes that are used in similar sort of instances are very effective. But maybe after a long period of time, these things get too ingrained to pull out of. He is a wasted talent, and it is sad for everyone that that talent never got to realize some of the stuff that it could and should have done. There were great moments left within him that haven't been shared with the world.
Sid's departure affected the creative output of the band. As their work became more progressive, it was evident that without Sid, 3-minute pop songs were not their forte.
Always found it very, very hard to whittle them down to 3 minutes. I mean, 5 or 6, you could say, yeah. 3 minutes, I've always found a tough call. I'd have loved to have written Waterloo Sunset. I mean, that's sort of the epitome of the 3-minute single, isn't it? We wouldn't have said no to it. We just didn't think we were very good at it.
Pink Floyd's second album was a saucer full of secrets, and the band continued a heavy touring schedule.
In the very early days, when I just joined the band, we were doing gigs all over the country. We had this old Bentley that took half a mile to stop. It's an old heap, and we drove up and down the country in it, and it had those little mahogany shelves that came down from the front seats, and Roger would usually drive and sit in the front with Nick, and we'd go to the first off-licence that we'd come to. They'd buy a bottle of whiskey and a bottle of Stone's ginger wine and mix them together, making Whiskey Max, which they would then drink all the way. The occasional reefer was about as far as it went on the way to a gig, and mostly in the studio there was nothing. You very quickly find out it just doesn't work. There are sort of little moments of inspiration that can be assisted, as we all know, by various moments of alteration of the mind, which can be post-alcoholic depression or anything that can spark off. But you can't carry on working to achieve those sort of things.
By the time the band's third album, Ummagumma, was released, there was little the band could do to escape the psychedelic tag.
We did, in interviews, constantly try to break down this myth about ourselves, that it was and is too powerful a thing, and people just are convinced that we did it all on LSD or whatever, and they don't want to hear you saying that you got in the studio at 10 o'clock in the morning and you worked hard till sort of 10 o'clock at night and then you went home. We knew that our audience believed us to be constantly out of our brains on whatever, and that it was necessary to be out of it to come to our gigs. I mean, I don't think it was, but that reputation had followed us from before I joined the band.
By the time the band recorded Atom Heart Mother in 1970, a familiar creative pattern was emerging that would continue for the rest of the band's career.
When it's going well is when it's heated. You fight for your corner, and Roger's corner tended to be the dynamics and the lyrics and getting the meaning and the message across, and mine tended to be more making the music really work. There are points where you've got a vehicle that's supporting the words, and trying to keep the balance between the importance, the weight of the words and the beauty of the music together is a very difficult thing. We used to have huge rows constantly about where the focus should be at any given point, and I can only see that as being good. That process continued right through the making of the Wall album, where we still worked very well together, had enormous rows, very heated sometimes, went on for days, but they were about areas of the record that we were making, the music, that mattered very much to us individually, and as our points of view came from slightly different places, they were enormously heated, but always, pretty well always resolved amicably in the end.
The band were now taking more time to experiment in the studio.
Playing with guitars and guitar amps is incredibly frustrating. The bloody things in the studio particularly never sound quite how you want them to sound. When you get a big amp and guitar up on a stage, you just turn it on and pretty much straight away you go, yeah, boom, and you're sort of leaning back against the sound. Trying to get that sort of vibe and feeling and sound of a guitar in a studio is a constantly frustrating thing. I'd spend a long time, mostly, just going, this thing doesn't sound quite right. For me, electric guitars are loud, I'm afraid. There's a bit of that heavy metal kid inside me I just can't sort of get away from. Everyone else on stage, all the way through our career, has always moaned and moaned at me. Can't you turn it down a little bit? I say, I'll try, and it doesn't sound quite there.
In 1971, Pink Floyd released Meddle, which included the full 23-minute version of Echoes, taking up one complete side of the album.
We used to go and sit in a studio or rehearsal room and just jam and throw ideas around and try and hang on to anything that sounded good, and new things would generally come out of that. One of these occasions was done in the studio, and we called it Nothing, parts 1 to 27, I think. They were just bits of music. They turned into echoes, I suppose. Started off life as Nothing, parts 1 to 27, then The Son of Nothing, and then The Return of the Son of Nothing.
Echoes is one of my favourites, but one that when we tried to do it live on the 1987 tour somehow didn't quite work. We did it 2 or 3 times, but for me it was something missing. Who knows? Grumpy bass player probably.
Dave Gilmour also clearly remembers difficulties recording the track One of These Days.
Often you can play a track and you can put yourself back in the studio when you were doing it, and you can remember funny things that happened. With One of These Days, for example, when we were going to cut the original track of that, which we did I think in a studio called Morgan in Kilburn, we had this roadie chap called Scott, and we were going to play 2 basses. Roger and I were going to play a bass and double track each other live, and the spare bass had dead strings on it. So we sent this chap off to buy a set of strings, and he never came back. He'd been off in some shop in the King's Road. He'd been pressing his trousers. He'd seen his girlfriend. And in the meantime, we had to cut the track. And if you listen to the 2 basses, one on your left and one in your right speaker, one of them has got this sort of much duller sound to it. It had these ancient old strings on it. And he came back and we said, "Where the hell have you been?" And he said, "I just went to get the strings and came straight back." And we said, "You just didn't. You've been 4 hours." And we said, "We know where you've been. You've been off seeing people and you've been home." He said, "I haven't been home. I just haven't been home." We said, "Well, we know you've been home. You've changed your trousers." He said, "Well, I might have been home, but I didn't change my trousers."
Shortly after the release of Meddle, Pink Floyd performed one of their now legendary concerts in Pompeii, which was filmed as part of a planned documentary. The project then took another 2 years to finish, and the band weren't completely happy with the outcome.
The the first moment being down there in Italy, playing the songs in that arena was good fun, but then all the faffing about afterwards rather spoilt the taste for me a little bit. It was roasting hot and we were in this enclosed arena, no wind, and we took our shirts off and stuff, and then we had to do some cutaway stuff in Paris, and they said, well, it's continuity, you've got to take your shirt off. And I said, but we're in a cold studio. It was ridiculous, all white, bleached English people taking their shirt off. It was done in about 1970 or 71, and by the time Dark Side of the Moon was nearly finished, it still wasn't out. So they came up and sort of did a bit more interview stuff at Abbey Road and threw in some moments of us pretending to make the Dark Side of the Moon record, which was actually us playing along to tracks that were already finished. And so it feels a bit sort of hacked about. It doesn't seem to have quite the flow that one would have hoped. Metal was the album that had just sort of come out when we made it, but Dark Side of the Moon was out before it was released.
In 1972, the band recorded Obscured by Clouds, the soundtrack to the film The Valley, and soundtracks were projects Pink Floyd had always been keen to develop.
We didn't really know where we wanted to go in the future at various times, and we did explore all sorts of other things just for the sake of exploration and for possibilities for things to do in the future. Film soundtracks was certainly one of the things we discussed, that when we're too old, because no one told us that you're allowed to be a pop star until sort of into your 40s or 50s. We did this bloody stupid ballet thing with Roland Petit, the Marseille Ballet, which was supposed to be with Rudolf Nureyev, but he pulled out at some point. These things, I don't know, they were all part of the process of exploration that we were going through.
This album also marked the first time the band had used synthesizers in the studio.
We had the VCS3 synthesizer, which was made by a guy called Peter Zinoviev, who had been at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. We got one of these VCS3 things with a keyboard. We'd had it for a year or so, and we still hadn't worked out how to set it up so that you could play a tune on the keyboard. We plugged it in, and every key you played the same note, and we thought that was what it was meant to do for quite a long time. And so all the stuff we would do, we'd set up a great sound on it, and we'd press the button, and you'd drop in on a tape and you'd record that one. Then you'd tune all the oscillators up to a different note, and then you'd drop in. Some of the parts on the Obscured by Clouds soundtrack, maybe some of them, they're great because they're so simple, but they're so simple because it was such a lot of work to try and make the bloody thing do anything.
You're listening to A Saucerful of Secrets on BBC Radio 2. In 1973, Pink Floyd began work on what was to become one of the most successful albums of all time, Dark Side of the Moon.
We rehearsed in a place called Broadhurst Gardens, which is up in Hampstead way, and that was just to start a new project, to write some new music. And we just, as we always did, just sat in a room, banged around, played stuff. I don't know at what point it was that Roger came in with the idea of tying it into a theme of madness and tying the whole record together like that, which is what we had been doing anyway on the previous records. At the beginning, they were all separate pieces. We went off and did gigs, we went off and did tours. We then rehearsed at the Stones place in Bermondsey, I think it was. But we certainly had the whole thing finished as a piece, toured it quite extensively. We were playing it in America, it must have been September 72, the year before it came out. And we played it in England at the Rainbow Theatre for several nights. So it was very well rehearsed by the time we got to the studio. As it developed, we knew that what we had was a better thing than we had done previously, I mean, by quantum leaps. And as it sort of neared its completion and all the bits fell together, the effects and the voices and all those things, it was obvious that it was light years away from what we'd done before. the extent of how much better it would do was not something that anyone could have really foreseen. We certainly didn't listen and pick up from other people to any great extent at the time. I don't think there was anyone doing anything remotely like what we were doing.
The album was a landmark masterpiece for its time and featured many innovative effects painstakingly pieced together.
There were no such things as samplers, there were no such things as sequencers. These things just didn't exist. If you wanted to get that sort of thing, tape loops were the way you did it. Sometimes you'd want really long loops, and you'd have the whole control room stacked up with mic stands all over the place, and tape would be running right around the room, 20 foot of tape, and people having to crawl underneath it to move around the room. And then it constantly getting trapped somewhere and getting chewed up, and you'd have to re-record a little bit or do something to slot back into it again. Roger made the loop up for the money thing just out of bits, and I think one or two of the sounds on the loop, when you're cutting up tape, you drop a bit and you pick it up and you can't tell which way round it should go. So you splice it back in and you play it and you find you've done a bit backwards by mistake, but one of them sounded great, so we left it. That sort of thing constantly happened. Working hard at it, trying to create something, then little fortuitous accidents that come along and you say, no, we can't do that, and you say, yeah, of course you can. It just sounds good, leave it.
Money became a hit in America, and the band embarked on a huge arena tour, which was to establish a live format they've continued with ever since.
Doing the effects was part of what we had been doing for years. We'd had a quadraphonic sound system before I joined the band, and they had that in 1967, but it got nicked somewhere, so we didn't get around to making another one for a couple of years because the parts weren't things that you could buy. But we always wanted to have a surround sound and create a whole environment. We very quickly dumped the idea of having support acts because they create a different atmosphere. They have their vibe, and so we sort of wanted to create a vibe where as people walked in, if it was an hour, 2 hours before the concert, it was already our environment. Roger loved being a frontman, leaping up and down and banging gongs and being dramatic. It's slightly a myth that we just stood there in darkness on stage and didn't do anything. I was never very good at it, getting out front. I just smouldered and brooded quietly. But Roger, even when he wasn't really significantly singing any of the lead stuff, he was still far more of a showman than me. Right from the first show we did after Dark Side came out in America, I can remember playing some stadium somewhere, and this sort of quiet, respectful tone that our audiences had previously disappeared. And they were all shouting and singing. Once the amount of your audience increases that radically, I think the people that used to come to see us before, which would be quite large amounts of people, up to 10,000 people in the city, they probably were reasonably genuine fans. But I think after that, when you get up to selling 50 or 60,000 tickets in a town, they're there for the party more than for anything else. We tend to become a bit of a sideshow. It's all jolly good fun, but, they're carrying in huge, great cases of beers, and they're finding their own picnic spot.
As the band became ever more successful, their legion of hardcore fans became obsessive, and Pink Floyd trivia became legendary. One of the more bizarre stories circulated over the years was that Dark Side of the Moon was recorded as a soundtrack to the movie The Wizard of Oz.
I tried it myself, it doesn't seem to work at all. It's a load of rubbish. Why on earth would we try to do a soundtrack for the Wizard of Oz? Give me a break.
In 1975, the band returned to the studio to start work on the difficult follow-up album, Wish You Were Here.
Some of the best musical moments aren't necessarily tied to the happiest moments of our career. For me, the album that does the most, is the best, if you like, is the Wish You Were Here album, which was not a particularly happy moment in our career because we'd just sort of done Dark Side of the Moon. We were left with the pressure of following Dark Side of the Moon up, and we had achieved every sort of success objective that one in one's boyhood dreams could dream of. And we all felt a little bit lost. And the very title of the album, Wish You Were Here, was sort of partly about Roger thinking that none of us were really present when we were making it. But somehow it captures a feeling of that. I mean, it's largely also about Sid and his absence, but I think he is on record as saying it was about our own sort of absence from each other to a certain extent. I think it's accurate. We just didn't particularly want to be in a studio. I don't know if we were nervous. It's like all the goals that you've been striving for since you're a teenager have suddenly been achieved, and you've got to say, well, now what's the goal?
2 years later came the album Animals.
Sheep's from the Animals album, an album that's slightly influenced by the onslaught of the punk movement. And certainly our sort of most raucous, toughest album in our oeuvre, I should think. You know, you have to learn your craft. It takes a long time, but we started off as real bumbling amateurs who really couldn't play very well at all. Some would say some of us haven't changed.
In 1979, the band released yet another classic, The Wall, which featured only their second hit single.
We don't need no education.
We've always put out singles from the albums, but it was always a sort of half-hearted attempt just to get a bit more airplay and stuff by putting out a single. We never really expected ever to have a hit single. The only one we thought would be was Another Brick in the Wall. Quite obviously one thought, oh, this is going to be a hit single. After all these years, finally.
The album also featured one of Dave Gilmour's favourite songs, Comfortably Numb.
Hello, is there anybody in there?
Comfortably Numb came from a song I'd half written when I was doing my first solo record. And when we were doing The Wall, Bob Ezrin encouraged me to bring in my bits and pieces that I had, which weren't many because I'd only just done a solo album the year before, so I'd used most things up, and just as I was finishing the mixing for that album, I wrote this tune and put it down, and I actually had some words for it which were different.
Recording the next album, 1983's Final Cut, was a bitter experience for the band.
I don't care for where Roger's head was at the time. And listening to it brings back memories, but most of all, whatever way I look at it, I think that the music was weak and didn't carry the ideas very satisfactorily. I think both musically and emotionally it's my lowest spot during our career. There was no feeling of people contributing together to making a record. It was one person dictating what he wanted, and really for the first time being unwilling to listen to advice and opinions on the basic quality of some of the basic music that was being proffered.
The feuds during the recording of the Final Cut proved too much for Roger Waters, and he left.
We worked extremely hard on, I mean, you know, the basic idea that one person could leave a pop group and deny the others the right to continue seemed intrinsically a bad idea, not a concept that was going to sort of run and run if it reached a courtroom, which luckily it never quite did.
Like many Pink Floyd fans, Dave Gilmour believes there are three clearly defined phases in the band's history.
Obviously, the flavour of the pop group changed fairly radically when Sid left, because he was the writer, the guitar player and the singer. I mean, he very, very much dominated proceedings. And afterwards, it became, by necessity, much more sort of democratic for a little while, which was eroded over the years to being something of Roger's great vision in some of these things. And then it became something which, under my sort of care, custodianship if you like, more about music again. And I don't have the great epic conceptual ideas that Roger has, so we do things different. This is the burden that everyone has to carry, you know. There is a so-called golden period in every successful artist's life, and they are forever thinking that they're doing just as well, but it's being ignored.
Whether or not the members of Pink Floyd ever perform again, there is no doubting their legendary status in rock history.
People having an affection for what is seen as our glory years, you know, from, if you like, from Medal through to The Wall, I can understand that, yes. I mean, artistically, when we were on song, it was a very good partnership. To regret that that partnership no longer exists is futile, because it couldn't exist in the way that it did when it worked.